Hello and welcome. Today, we are going to talk about what is, quite possibly, the single most important chemical reaction for all life here on our planet: photosynthesis. Yep, it's the incredible process that lets plants literally eat sunlight. Okay, let's dive right in. So let me just ask you this straight up. If you had to pick just one, what do you think is the most important chemical reaction on Earth? Now, I know there are a lot of contenders, but today we're making the case for photosynthesis. And why? Well, because without it, our world as we know it would just cease to exist. And that's because, at its core, photosynthesis is the engine that powers almost everything alive. I mean, it's the ultimate source of our food and the oxygen we breathe. But our understanding of this whole process, it didn't just happen overnight. Let's take a quick look at that journey of discovery.
Yeah, this really was a centuries-long scientific puzzle. It started way back in the 1600s when Van Helmont figured out that plants were taking in water. A whole century later, Ingenhousz connected the dots and realized light was essential. Then, in 1845, Mayer had this groundbreaking idea that the light energy was actually being converted into chemical energy. And then finally, in the 1950s, a guy named Melvin Kelvin meticulously mapped out the entire path for how carbon gets used, giving us what we now call the Kelvin cycle.
So here's the bottom line. Every single bite of food you eat, doesn't matter if it's a salad or a burger, it all traces its energy right back to this process. Photosynthesis is the base of the entire food web, and it's the source of the oxygen we're breathing right now.
To really get this, we need to zoom in. I mean, way in. Let's imagine a plant cell is like a bustling little green factory. Come on, let's take a tour and see where all the machinery is and how it actually works.
Okay, so the main factory building itself? That's a tiny little part of the cell called the chloroplast. This is the specialized spot inside plant cells where every single step of photosynthesis goes down. If you see green on a plant, you're actually seeing millions and millions of these little factories at work. Now, inside this factory, we find the real machinery. These are the thylakoids. They're basically stacks of membranes that act just like solar panels on the factory roof. Their one and only job is to capture all that raw energy from the sunlight to kickstart the whole process. And all around those solar panels is a fluid-filled space called the stroma. You can think of this as the main factory floor. It's right here that all that captured solar energy is finally put to work to assemble the final product, sugar.
So how does this factory actually run its operations? Well, it's not just one magic step. It's actually a brilliant two-part assembly line that is perfectly designed to turn light, water, and air into food.
This assembly line has two main stages. First up, you have the light-dependent reactions. Think of this as the power generation step. It's capturing solar energy and storing it in these tiny molecular battery packs. Then the second stage, which you might have heard of, the Kelvin cycle, uses the power from those batteries to actually build the sugar. Let's look a little closer at that power generating step, because the factory actually has two ways to do this. The main pathway, the one that does most of the work, produces two different kinds of energy packets: ATP, which is kind of like a quick burst of energy, and NADPH, which is used for building stuff. And this main process, it's what releases the oxygen we breathe. But there's also a simpler, shorter loop that just churns out extra ATP whenever the factory floor needs a little more power.
All right, now we can head over to the main factory floor, the Kelvin cycle. This is where a master worker enzyme named Rubisco goes to work, grabbing carbon dioxide right out of the air. Then, using all the energy from those ATP and NADPH packets we just made, it starts building stable sugar molecules like glucose. And just like that, light energy from 93 million miles away has been turned into chemical energy, into food. Pretty amazing, right?
But nature is a brilliant engineer. The standard factory design, which we call C3, it works great, but it's got a tiny flaw. So over millions of years, evolution came up with an upgrade, especially for plants that have to live in tougher, hotter conditions. And that upgrade is called C for photosynthesis. So on one hand, you've got your standard C3 plants, things like rice and wheat. They have this wasteful little problem where that key enzyme, Rubisco, sometimes grabs oxygen by mistake instead of the CO2 it's supposed to. We call that photorespiration. But C4 plants, like corn and sugarcane, they evolved a super clever pre-processing step that basically force feeds a concentrated dose of CO2 right to Rubisco, pretty much eliminating that wasteful error.
So how much of a difference does this upgrade really make? Well, it makes C4 plants roughly 50% more efficient. 50%. In the natural world, that is a huge competitive advantage, especially when things get hot and dry.
So why does understanding this natural factory matter so much for us today? Well, because by learning all its secrets, we might actually be able to hack it to help solve some of our biggest future challenges.
You know, one really interesting side effect of climate change is that rising CO2 levels can act as a kind of fertilizer for those C3 plants, potentially boosting their growth by a lot. But here's the catch. The benefits of all that extra CO2 might get canceled out by the stress from higher temperatures, which, you guessed it, increases that wasteful photorespiration we just talked about.
This is where the future gets really exciting. Scientists are working on some huge goals, like giving rice, one of the world's most important foods, that super efficient C4 upgrade to help feed a growing planet. And at the same time, other researchers are trying to build totally new technologies that mimic the entire process from the ground up. And this isn't some far-off science fiction either. Get this, researchers have already created what they call artificial leaves. They are these tiny devices about the size of a postage stamp that can take in sunlight and CO2 and turn them into valuable chemicals for making fuels and other materials. Which leaves us with this final, fascinating question. For billions of years, plants have perfected the art of turning sunlight into life. And now, maybe it's our turn. Can we learn enough from these tiny green factories to build our own leaves and power the future? It's an amazing thing to think about.